The enemy within gets out on bail. It's December 23rd, and I'll tell you the most terrifying part of terrorist Omar Khadr's release from jail.
Why should others go to jail when you're the biggest carbon consumer I know?
There's 8,500 customers here, and you won't give them an answer.
You come here once a year with a sign, and you feel morally superior.
The only thing I have to say to the government about why I publish it is because it's my bloody right to do so.
Remember when I wrote the book, The Enemy Within? It's all about Omar Khadr, the terrorist, his confessions, how he clearly set out to kill American soldiers, and how he threw the grenade that killed Sergeant Christopher Speer and blinded Sergeant Lane Morris. I knew things were bad when he was released from Guantanamo Bay to Canada. The welcome home signs, the weird love-in the media had with him. It was only a matter of time before this terrorist actually got out of jail and began roaming Canadian streets. Well, this year it happened. On May 7th, Omar Khadr was released on bail with conditions. He couldn't fly, his computer was monitored, and he had to wear a tracking bracelet. But just a few months after Khadr was released on bail, his conditions were actually eased. And I was the only one in the media to criticize this decision. Seriously, everyone else was cheering. Take a look at my initial reaction.
In a shocking attack on public safety, an extremist judge in Edmonton has removed essential public security protections from Omar Khadr's bail conditions. According to Justice June Ross, Khadr, a convicted murderer and an unrepentant member of Al-Qaeda, should now be able to fly on Canadian passenger planes and can visit his family in Toronto. He no longer has to speak with them in English so that police can monitor his conversations. He no longer has to wear a tracking bracelet on his ankle. The police surveillance software on his computer must be removed. This isn't just some run-of-the-mill soft-on-crime liberal justice. This is an outright pro-terrorist ruling. It truly puts Canadian lives at risk. It would be no different than putting Paul Bernardo back on the street. This extremist ruling must be appealed by the government. Omar Khadr is a terrorist. His father, Ahmed Khadr, was a terrorist too, a personal friend of Osama bin Laden. Ahmed Khadr was killed in a gun battle with Pakistani anti-terrorism police. Omar Khadr's mother and sister publicly brag about being Al-Qaeda supporters too. Here, listen to these disgusting women.
We believe that death comes when God have planned it before he created the humanity.
His mother Maha on the left and sister Zainab deny that the family was ever officially part of Al-Qaeda, but readily admit they are sympathetic to the bin Laden organization.
Why does nobody say you killed 3 of his friends? Why does everybody say he killed an American soldier? Big deal.
And of course, Omar Khadr himself murdered Christopher Speer, a U.S. Army medic, leaving his wife Tabitha Speer a widow and their children Taryn and Tanner fatherless. Khadr later bragged to guards at Guantanamo Bay that murdering Speer was the greatest moment of his life. Khadr confessed in great detail to his terrorist activities and the murder. In addition, captured Al-Qaeda propaganda videos show Khadr gleefully assembling roadside bombs of the sort that killed many Canadian soldiers in Afghanistan. This is outrageous. Ordinary criminals have police tracking bracelets on their ankles, but this judge took them off Omar Khadr because he complained, get this, that they interfered with his ability to play soccer. Seriously, and the judge thought that Omar Khadr playing soccer was more important than the public safety interest of having a police tracking bracelet on his ankle. Police had surveillance programs on his computer too. Not anymore. Judge Ross said they were unusually restrictive. Really? In what world is it unusual to want to watch a terrorist convicted of war crimes? And a week after the anniversary of 9/11, ruling that Khadr can now fly on jet planes, an Al-Qaeda terrorist. Would you want to be on a plane sitting next to Omar Khadr? What's next? A judge ordering WestJet or Air Canada to let him board their planes?
We did a poll and found out that an overwhelming number of Canadians agree lifting these bail conditions went too far. You can see the full results by clicking here or going to jailkhadr.com. After the break, I'll show you the most egregious examples of the media love-in with this terrorist. Omar Khadr's bail should have been shocking, but the media response was, finally. It's no surprise they've turned a terrorist into a folk hero. Remember earlier this year when the Toronto Globe Mail wrote a column whining that they couldn't do an interview from prison with Omar Khadr?
So I'm reading the funny papers, the Globe and Mail's editorial. I call them the funny papers because you got to have a sense of humor to write a whole editorial about Omar Khadr without using the words Al-Qaeda, terrorist, convicted murderer, or war criminal. That's what Omar Khadr is. But here they call him a child soldier, even though he was neither a child nor a soldier when he murdered Christopher Speer. What are they on about today in the funny pages? They're weeping that Omar Khadr is not allowed to give a propaganda interview from prison. As in, left-wing pro-Khadr journalists want to do a documentary, want to be his PR agents, as they are for every other terrorist in the world, and the warden says no. The Globe and Mail thinks that's abominable, and they should appeal a court ruling keeping the journalists out. What would we think if the Globe and Mail demanded that a documentary crew or a PR firm had access to Paul Bernardo to hear from his side of the story? This is a disgrace, not only to the memory of Christopher Speer, who was murdered by Omar Khadr, but to everyone in our military who's fighting against Al-Qaeda and Taliban, and every Canadian who thinks terrorists should be in jail and journalists should report the news, not be stenographers for Al-Qaeda.
Remember when the Toronto Star actually said that Omar Khadr should receive the Order of Canada? I am serious. I am not making this up. Take a look.
Well, Canada's largest newspaper, the Toronto Star, wants to share with you an idea they have. The idea is Omar Khadr, convicted, confessed Al-Qaeda terrorist and murderer, should get the Order of Canada. Take a listen.
I'm not saying Omar Khadr should get the Order of Canada, though it's a thought. He's the young Canadian arrested in Afghanistan at 13 years ago, charged with war crimes after being in a firefight. He has wide support here.
Did you hear what Rick Zalutton said? He didn't use the word Al-Qaeda or terrorist throughout the whole thing. He said that Omar Khadr was, quote, charged with war crimes, but that's not true. He was charged, but he also confessed to them and was convicted of them. Rick Zalutton also says that Omar Khadr has wide support here in Canada. Show me a single poll outside of the media party that shows that he has wide support. You can't. Canadians hate terrorists and murderers, and only in a very small circle of insiders at the Toronto Star and CBC and the legal profession, I hate to admit, does Omar Khadr have wide support. You'll notice if you watch the whole clip, and I won't subject you to it, that Rick Zalutton doesn't use other words also. He doesn't mention Christopher Speer, the U.S. Army medic murdered in cold blood by Omar Khadr. Doesn't mention Christopher Speer's widow, Tabitha Speer, or his fatherless children, Taryn and Tanner. And it also doesn't mention, Zalutton in the Star doesn't mention the details of Omar Khadr's confession. Let me show you paragraph 21 of Omar Khadr's detailed confession, a confession approved, by the way, by Omar Khadr's very zealous lawyers. This is what Omar Khadr said is the truth. If you see here in paragraph 21, he said he was specifically trained to attack Jews, to kill Jews, and that he believed that Jews should be killed. He's an anti-Semite, but not just a soft, passive Jew hater. He is trained and was on a mission to murder Jews. Isn't it odd that Rick Zalutton, a Jew himself, would suggest Omar Khadr for an Order of Canada? Omar Khadr, who has never renounced Al-Qaeda, let alone anti-Semitism or the jihad. It's odd to me that the Toronto Star, by circulation, the largest newspaper in Canada, in the most Jewish city in Canada, 200,000 Jews here, feels so casual about normalizing an anti-Semitic Muslim Nazi who has no compunction or regret about what he did.
But the worst of the media love-in came after Omar Khadr was released. I'll tell you about that next.
Looking for the perfect gift? Did you know the Rebel.media has a store? Make a statement with a t-shirt. Have your morning coffee in a Fearless Travel coffee mug. There's even an Ezra Levant bobblehead. It's a one-stop shop for the perfect gift. And don't forget to pick up something for yourself. Go to therebel.media/store to find out more.
It's no surprise the media loves Omar Khadr. I've been telling you about this terrorist for years and the media love for him. But what about what happens when the terrorist is actually released onto our streets? Well, their love deepened. I'm not kidding. It all started with the CBC, that's your tax dollars, by the way, airing a starry-eyed documentary. But it gets worse. It was made in partnership with Al Jazeera. Take a look.
Locked up for more than half his life,
I'll prove to them that I'm a good person.
Omar Khadr sits down for his first exclusive interview.
See who I am as a person, not as a name.
A documentary co-production, Omar Khadr, Out of the Shadows, tonight at 9 on CBC.
I went through the early release of the film showing how they portrayed Khadr as a victim, not a murderer, how they refrained from using words like Taliban or Al-Qaeda, how they actually called Omar Khadr's terrorist father a humanitarian worker. It was disgusting. It was a pro-Khadr attempt to turn him into some sort of folk hero, but really we've come to expect that from the Toronto Star and the CBC. Well, they released this with great fanfare. Both were promoting each other. They talked about the role of the CBC, they talked about the role of the Toronto Star, and they talked about the role of the actual documentary film company called White Pine. But look, here is the CBC's webpage about their Khadr whitewash, turning him into a celebrity. You'll notice that they don't mention the words Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera, as you know, is the state-owned propaganda TV station from the country of Qatar. Qatar, of course, is a major funder of terrorists like the Islamic State. Qatar is an OPEC dictatorship. Qatar hates Canada. We are actually fighting a proxy war against Qatar right now. They're funding the Islamic State, and we're attacking the Islamic State with our CF-18 jets. You'll notice that the CBC doesn't mention anything about Al Jazeera, but look at Al Jazeera's website. Al Jazeera is releasing this film too. And according to Al Jazeera, the whole film was a collaboration between the Star and the CBC and White Pine and Al Jazeera America, and Al Jazeera Arabic. Why did the CBC not reveal to Canadians that their propaganda film to whitewash Al-Qaeda terrorist Omar Khadr was made in collaboration with Al Jazeera? Why did the CBC not tell us that they were working with and presumably taking money from a state broadcaster of a foreign country that funds terrorism? Why did the CBC not tell us about any of this? They certainly boasted about their other partners and sponsors. Normally when someone sponsors a movie on the CBC, they get massive credit in the form of an ad or in a sponsorship arrangement. Why did they deliberately hide this? Al Jazeera isn't just the state broadcaster of a foreign country. It is the go-to station for terrorists. When Osama bin Laden was making his Attack the West recordings, he would give them to Al Jazeera knowing that they would play them lovingly. The CBC did a deal with Al Jazeera. And why? What for? Was it for the cash? Was it for the editorial control? You'll remember that when Omar Khadr first came out of jail, Omar Khadr's lawyer and propagandist Dennis Edney insisted that no reporters ask tough questions. Here's a reminder of how that looked.
I've had a long day, and I don't mind going back into that house. So let's just be respectful here, okay? Omar's going to say a few words. You can also ask him certain questions. If the questions become too intrusive, then I'll shut it down, and we'll go back in the house.
As I asked yesterday, what limits did Dennis Edney and Omar Khadr put on reporters and the CBC documentary? But now I've got a whole other question. What editorial conditions did Al Jazeera put on it? If Al Jazeera was taking OPEC money from Qatar to help make this film, what were the details of the agreement? The CBC has a higher standard to answer to than the Toronto Star. If the Toronto Star wants to sell out to foreign governments, that's a disgrace, but in the end of the day, that's their business. But what about when a Canadian Crown corporation owned by Canadian taxpayers, subsidized by $1 billion a year by Canadian taxpayers, does a secret deal with an arm of a foreign government? We must know all the details of that contract. We have to know what the demands of Al Jazeera were. We have to know how much Al Jazeera paid. We have to know what Al Jazeera's editorial control was. And we have to know what other secret deals the CBC has with Al Jazeera or other state broadcasters. Does this explain why the CBC is so hostile to Canada's war against the Islamic State? Because they're in bed with the Qatar-owned Al Jazeera. Other countries have state-run propaganda arms too, like Vladimir Putin controls Russia Today, a propaganda arm. Russia Today and Al Jazeera both hate Canada's oil sands and fracking. Is there a secret deal between the CBC and other state broadcasters on other subjects too? It sounds absurd and paranoid to even ask the question, but I think that paranoid is deserved given that the CBC deliberately withheld information about their Al Jazeera deal. This film is a disgrace on the face of it. It's not a genuine documentary. It doesn't ask any real questions about Omar Khadr's jihadist views. It doesn't probe him deeply. It was an attempt to whitewash him. That's a disgrace. But now that we know it was funded by a propaganda arm for a terrorist-supporting dictatorship, the CBC has to do a lot of answering itself.
Maclean's magazine actually ran a cover with Omar Khadr on it, with two innocent women who were victims of brutal violence, Renelle Harper and Amanda Lindout. And they were victims, but they called Khadr a victim too. No reaction from the media party. But when I tweeted a Photoshop edition of this cover with Omar Khadr holding a scimitar, oh, the media party lost it there. Take a look.
I have an update. A viewer sent me this very subtly modified image that you might not even notice at first. Look, he photoshopped a large sword into Khadr's hands. You don't notice it right away, do you? But then you can't miss it, and it's shocking because they're all smiling, the two rape victims and the murderer on the cover of the magazine together. The sword is shocking because it reminds you how inappropriate putting two rape victims smiling in the same cover as a Al-Qaeda terrorist smiling is. It's just so weird. This sword reminds you of how inappropriate it is. That's great guerrilla counterjournalism, I thought. I mean, Maclean's is just gross. I suppose People magazine in the US puts Kim Kardashian on the cover when they need to sell some copies. She's gross, but she didn't murder anyone. What's next? I don't know. Maclean's doing a dating advice column with Paul Bernardo or something. My point is that sword is so dissonant, it's a reminder that what Maclean's doing is grotesque. Anyway, so just as a lark, I tweeted this photoshopped image on Twitter with no comment. I just said Maclean's. Now, most people didn't even really notice the subtle change, but then a bunch of journalists saw the Photoshop and lashed out as a pack. Not at Maclean's for putting a terrorist on their cover, but at me for reminding anyone that he was a terrorist. Here, take a look at some of the tweets that came as a wolf pack at me. Here's Jimmy Thompson, who writes for Vice and the Globe and Mail and the Toronto Star. Here he is suggesting the Photoshop was racist, lame, or desperate. Not Maclean's putting a terrorist on their cover as a celebrity and a victim, but me reminding people that he was a terrorist. That's racist, according to one journalist. Here's another journalist, Chris Vandenbrekel, a radio reporter in Fort McMurray. "You disgust me," he wrote. "This is propaganda on your part, not theirs." Pardon? It's not propaganda to call a murderer a victim, but it's propaganda to remind people he's a murderer. Say, do you think Vandenbrekel's listeners in Fort McMurray would agree with him? I wrote back to him and invited him to open his radio talk show phone lines about the subject, get a bit of a reality check from real people on what they think of terrorists. Here's a tweet from my old friend, that loser with Vice magazine, Mac Lamra. He said, "One day you're going to get someone seriously hurt with your vile rhetoric, Levant." Look at how much dumb is crammed into those 14 words. Lamara is worried about getting someone seriously hurt, apparently. Yeah, me too, like Sergeant Christopher Speer, murdered by Omar Khadr. Maclean's venerating a terrorist as a folk hero isn't vile to Mac, but me criticizing them is, and of course the implication that my mere words need to be reined in. There's that flicker of authoritarian censorship on the left again. Here's another journalist, Taylor Lambert, who is surprisingly inarticulate for a journalist. He's not a sharp thinker. All he can do is swear. He's not sure why he's upset, but here's the weirdest examples. My former colleagues at the Sun newspaper chain. I mean, the Sun is the tough on crime newspaper chain, the anti-terrorist chain, and it believes in irreverent journalism too, poking fun at things, photoshops on their cover. But for some reason, a bunch of Sun journalists were outraged by me and my tweet. Here's Trevor Robb from the Edmonton Sun He tells me I'm not classy. But McLean's is classy to celebrate a terrorist? I'm not classy for mocking them. And everyone knows that the Sun is all about classy. Here's Dave Dormer of the Calgary Sun, probably the most right-wing readers in Canada, but he says it was beyond the pale. Not McLean's, but me for mocking McLean's. Here's Tyler Dawson of the Ottawa Citizen, also owned by Post Media, who was so shocked he didn't know what to say, but he tweeted about it several times. That's the lame millennial rebuttal to anything. I can't even. I can't even. I saw that a lot. I should remind you that the Ottawa Citizen was the newspaper that literally gave Omar Khadr a guest column in their newspaper without a disclaimer that he was a convicted terrorist, murderer, to talk about national security and terrorism, literally on the day of Corporal Nathan Cirillo's funeral. On the day Canada was burying a young soldier murdered by a Muslim terrorist, the newspaper of record in our capital city gave a Muslim terrorist a column in their editorial pages. What would a millennial say? Yeah, I can't even. There were so many more tweets, I won't go through them all. The intellectual class, or the self-described intellectual class, everyone who calls themselves a writer, weirdly. I don't get it, writers. Here's one. Here's another one. Here's another one. I mean, what's with these writers? Here's a writer who thinks I should be sued for being so mean. You know, when I say the phrase media party, I'm often talking about partisan politics like their love affair for Justin Trudeau, but most of the time, in between elections, the media party is even more pernicious. The media party is not just a partisan monoculture, it's an ideas monoculture, and it is depraved. And anyone who would be more upset about a Photoshop of a sword in Omar Khadr's hands than they are upset with Omar Khadr being normalized in Maclean's Magazine's Remembrance Day edition, that's a sign of deep sickness in our media, don't you think?
Can you believe that? Look, I'm worried about Omar Khadr and what he will do now that he's out of jail. But I'm even more worried that the media won't report on it, won't report on the warning signs, because we don't want to hurt his feelings. Don't go away, more after the break.
Ontario residents are being hosed on electricity prices. The latest Auditor General's report says we've been overcharged by $37 billion over the last several years. That works out to nearly $2,800 for every man, woman, and child. Why? Mismanagement and bad policy choices from the Ontario Liberals. It's going to cost us billions more in coming years. Energy Minister Bob Chiarelli won't take responsibility. He's lashing out. It's time for Bob to go. If you agree, go to firebob.ca. That's firebob.ca and make your voice heard.
The media will paint their own story about Omar Khadr, how he just couldn't have a bad bone in his body with that nice smile. But the facts are the facts and the evidence is the evidence. That's him making those IEDs. His father worked for the Taliban. Khadr himself signed a confession pleading guilt to the murder of Sergeant Speer. That confession was approved by his lawyers. Those are the facts. And you can read more about it in my book, The Enemy Within. There's a link below. Or go to KhadrFacts.com by clicking here. Tell me what you think. Is Omar Khadr a risk to public safety? Is the media party complacent or actually colluding with him to build him up to be an innocent hero? Tell me your thoughts. Email me at ezra@therebel.media or comment below. There's one thing I know. Here at The Rebel, we won't stop going against the mainstream media and fighting for freedom and against terrorist threats. Good night.